Have you watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail? If you haven't, you've probably seen clips. The knight hopping on one leg, blood spurting, claiming, "'Tis but a flesh wound." The two class-conscious peasants discussing how a sword tossed by a moist bint is no way to pick a system of governance. And most importantly, for today, the runaway scene, as knights flee from the rabbit of Cairnbog, who eventually is defeated using the holy hand grenade of Antioch. But did you know that that last scene is grounded in history? Not fully, but of course. Medieval monks created illustrations in the margins of books where they showed killer rabbits, rabbits in armor, rabbits wielding swords, rabbits hunting hunters, and so on. It was actually pretty peak medieval humor. But why? Why were rabbits in armor so funny at the time? And more importantly, how can you use what we know about humor to create humor in your fantasy world? That's what I want to talk about today. Welcome to another episode of Just In Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. We'll start with doing the thing they say you should never do, explaining the joke. Well, specifically, explaining humor. There are three psychological or philosophical theories about humor, each of them explaining some parts of why we laugh better than others. First up is the incongruity theory. This theory posits that humor arises from a mismatch between expectations and reality, which creates cognitive dissonance, which results in laughter. Of the three, this theory is the most widely accepted and very well supported empirically. The sudden realization of an incongruity, whether logical, semantic, or situational, triggers amusement by surprising the audience and subverting their expectations. For example, there's an ant walking along a river and it sees a hippo in the river and it says, "Hippo, get out right now." And the hippo gets up and the ant looks the hippo up and he looks him down and he says, "Hippo, get back in the river. Get back in the river right now." And the hippo gets back into the river. And the ant finds a crocodile and the scene repeats. And finally the ant finds an elephant and again demands that the giant beast exits and enters the river. The elephant glares at the ant and says, "Ant, what the hell are you doing?" And the ant replies, "Who of you buggers stole my bathing costume?" I'll pause here while you pick yourself up off the floor from laughing your ass off. It's funny because of the size difference and the unexpected nature of the ant's response. And indeed, neuroscientific evidence supports this theory by showing activation in the brain regions responsible for detecting and resolving incongruities, such as the prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobes when we hear a joke like that has incongruous elements to it. However, incongruity doesn't explain all jokes or all situations that we find humorous. So let's consider superiority theory. Superiority theory, championed by Hobbes, Plato, and Aristotle, so a real trio of, just the best people, says that humor arises from feelings of superiority over others or past selves. In essence, laughter is a manifestation of the sudden glory we feel when recognizing our supremacy or the absurdity of others' misfortune. This theory explains why humor often involves aggression, sarcasm, or satire, where the laughter reinforces social hierarchies or personal triumphs. Basically, this is why people sometimes laugh at racist or sexist jokes. It makes them feel superior and cements their place in the social hierarchy. I won't tell any of the jokes in this vein. Trust me, I was one of 3 women in a class of 40 computer scientist students. I've heard every single joke you can imagine. Let's move on to relief theory. In this theory, humor is viewed as a mechanism to release pent-up psychological tension or stress, providing emotional relief. The benign violation theory, BVT, an extension of relief theory, posits that humor occurs when a situation violates expectations or norms but is perceived as harmless or non-threatening. This theory explains why humor is context dependent and why some taboo or inappropriate topics can be funny in certain settings, but not in others. So here's an example of a joke that kind of covers all of them. And my apologies, I am translating this from Afrikaans, so some nuance will be lost. John arrives at his friend Mike's place for a beer on Monday night with a stinking giant black eye. And Mike asks him, "What in the heck happened, buddy?" So John says, "No, you see, yesterday I was in church and we had all the farmers come in, so I was a little late. And so I ducked into one of the back pews. And just as we were starting to stand up for the opening hymn, the doorways darkened and a woman walked in. Mike, she was a giant, taller than me and broader too, with a farmer's arms and legs that could pull a tractor. And she was wearing a pink dress. But if I call it a dress, what I mean is that it was a tent big enough to shelter a church bazaar. And she sat down in front of me, completely obscuring the pulpit. Well, I didn't need to see the priest to hear the message, right? So I sat and I listened, no problem. But then we rose for the first hymn. And Mike, if there's one thing I hate with the ladies' clothing, it's when their dress rides up between their ass cheeks. And this lady, that giant pink dress rode up between in that mighty cleft. But I grit my teeth and I tried to keep my eyes on my hymn books, and we got through the second song. But as we got to the third song, I couldn't. And I stretched out my arm and I pulled the dress out, and she turned around and she smacked me straight in the eye. Mike commiserates with John and they have a beer and life moves on. And during the week, John nurses his eye and slowly it heals. But next week, Monday, he gets back to Mike's place with one eye half healed and a new black eye. So Mike says to him, "But what in the heck happened, buddy?" And John says, "Well, you see, I was at church again, and like a creature of habit, I went back to the pew that I sat in last time. And there was another man sitting next to me this time. And just as the first song was starting, the church darkened, the lady in the pink dress came in, and she sat in front of us. Now this time I knew. I prepared myself. When we got up to sing, I kept my eyes on the hymn book and I sang. But the guy next to me, clearly her dress irritated him too, because he pulled it out from between her cheeks. And because I knew she didn't like it, I pushed it back in." Now, once you finished laughing, and I genuinely do hope you laughed at that one, it is my favorite joke. Here's how it fits into those humor categories we just discussed. First, it is a narrative joke. It relies on a slow, detailed build-up that creates anticipation. The storyteller paints a vivid, almost absurd picture of the scene, which engages the listener's imagination and makes the eventual punchline more satisfying. The primary humor arises from the mismatch between expectations and reality. The audience expects John to learn from his mistake, but he doubles down on the absurdity by pushing the dress back in after someone else pulls it out. The incongruity is heightened by the setting, which is a church, a place of reverence and decorum, and the character, this giant imposing woman in her pink dress. The contrast between the sacred and the ridiculous amplifies that sense of humor. The joke also plays with taboo subjects like bodily functions, the dress riding up between the lady's ass cheeks, the physical intrusion, and social impropriety in a religious setting. And it's also a highly visual joke. You should easily be able to imagine the scene and the kind of awkwardness of it. And then, of course, there's the whole physicality of the joke, which basically adds a layer of slapstick to the whole thing. But most importantly, the joke relies on shared cultural knowledge. The idea of the church as a place of decorum and the awkwardness of bodily functions and the social taboo of touching strangers. So without that shared culture, the joke makes no sense. So that was a very long explanation of why humor is funny, and I hope it all made sense and didn't ruin too many jokes for you. Now, before we get back to those rabbits and how you can build a world where funny jokes exist, give me one moment to tell you about Sangwheel Chronicles, where admittedly the jokes are rare because, well, it's a dark fantasy saga. Sangwheel Chronicles is Louis's story, and he is an assassin that one reviewer described as a medieval James Bond. The series is complete at 4 books and is available on my website as an ebook box set with 8 pieces of human-drawn character art included as high-res digital copies. Or you can get the physical copies via Amazon or any other online bookshop. Oh, on a side note, I won Flash 500's novel opening competition, so at least you know I can write reasonably well. Links to all that down below. I've currently got the physical book on pre-sale on the website, so that has a 20% discount applied and will ship in June 2026. Okay, now let's get back to humor. So we're going to return to those rabbits and speak more about why culturally they're funny. The study of medieval illuminated manuscripts really has these rabbits in the sideline, and they are presented as hyper aggressive, weapon wielding rabbits. These are called drolleries or grostiques, and they haunt especially the borders of the 13th and 14th century psalters and prayer books. And there's a lot of them. I'll show you some examples on the screen. So clearly they were a pretty persistent meme. But why? So for that we have to understand the position the rabbit was in the medieval world. It was a vulnerable animal. In the medieval period, rabbits and hares were managed, hunted, and consumed on a pretty large scale. And you'd think it was peasants doing the consuming, and you'd be wrong. Rabbits, for example, were not indigenous to the British Isles. They were introduced by the Normans in the 13th century, initially requiring intensive care to thrive. Rabbits were kept in fenced-off artificial warrens known as pillow mounds. This practice served as a vital source of food and pelts, with a significant portion of the French and English economies supported by the skinning and consumption of rabbits. Because they were valuable commodities and protected by law, the rabbit became a symbol of aristocratic privilege. Yes, really, the rabbit. And because rabbits were so well looked after, and because they were so vulnerable, and because they were also a sign of purity, it created a comedic tension that was satisfied in this rabbit's revenge. In a world where rabbits were systemically skinned and eaten by humans, the image of a rabbit taking up a sword or an axe against its tormentors was the ultimate absurdity. It was an inversion of the natural hierarchy, where the most timid and defenseless of animals becomes a ruthless administrator of justice. And it's the cornerstone of that kind of incongruity. Heck, in the Smithfield Decretals, we get a whole little arc, almost like a comic book strip. A group of giant beefy rabbits ambush a human hunter. A rabbit archer shoots him in the spine. Then the rabbits bind the hunter with ropes and haul him before a rabbit judge. And after the inevitable guilty verdict for crimes against rabbit kind, the hunter is dragged away. And finally, the narrative concludes with the rabbits beheading the hunter with a massive sword. It's an awesome little story. In a way, the rabbit also represented the people. There were even rabbits chopping off the head of a king, which is a subversive comic if I ever saw one. And so these little images represented a safety valve, a release from the intense hierarchy of people's lives. And it is probably from these rabbits that the Monty Python got its rabbit inspiration for the monster of Cairnabog, which we still found funny because the idea of a docile rabbit turning violent pings into incongruity very smoothly, along with a healthy dose of gallows humor if you're living under the boot of a king. Okay, but how do I apply it to my world, I hear you say? I'm glad you asked. First, you need to establish your baseline. Are there Is your culture hierarchical, security focused, laissez-faire? Establish especially their norms from folkways to taboos. And if you need help with that, check out the video where I tackle exactly that topic. So once you've established the culture and their norms, it's time for some judicious subversion. How does humor release the tension created by those taboos? Think of the rabbits again. Those rabbits relieve the tension of the highly hierarchical medieval period. What is your people's strictest taboo? What jokes do they tell to subvert that taboo and provide a safety valve? Or what images provide humor? Or even little clay statues? Anything can be humor with a little imagination. Second, what is really frowned on, but not quite a taboo, like tugging on a woman's dress? Or what is a place of high decorum, like a church? What would break that decorum? Is it funny if someone farts in church, for example? This isn't quite the taboo breaking humor. It's breaking the mores of your culture. And lastly, think of simple incongruity, like my ant joke. It's funny, but not that funny. It's basically your clean icebreaker joke. And if you make up one joke for each main character inside of their culture, I think you'll have a richer, more lived-in culture for every nook and cranny of your world. And now, while the awesome members of the channel scroll past, let me tell you why sometimes humor doesn't work. First, a joke can fail because of the storyteller. A joke's effectiveness depends on delivery, tone, timing, and expression. So, a poorly timed or delivered humor falls flat. Instead of being funny, it just becomes across as weird or even worse, offensive. And speaking of offense, humor is culturally and socially embedded. What is funny in one culture or group may not be in another. I kill myself laughing at that lady in the pink dress joke, especially told in Afrikaans by Jan Spies. But I'm pretty sure that joke doesn't work in China, for example. If you want to see the original of that joke, I'll leave a link in the description, but if you don't speak Dutch or Afrikaans, I'm not sure how much sense it'll make for you. Anyway, cultural mismatch can lead to failed humor, which actually makes for a great world-building tool, as you can show the difference between cultures by showing what one culture finds funny and what another culture doesn't understand. And that creates that conflict between cultures. And finally, a joke can fall flat if the incongruity of a joke is too obscure or the emotional tone is misread. The brain's processing of humor involves detecting and resolving incongruities, as we said. If this process is disrupted by thinking too hard or by not quite getting it, then no laughter for you. What's the best joke you know? Have you created jokes for any of your cultures? Why do you think humor works? Let me know in the comments. And if you can't think of anything to say and you made it this far, leave me a laughing emoji down there. If you want to see more from me, check out my video on giving characters a unique accent. And I will see you soon for another episode.